John, you have some new details about specific lines that you can quote from this 2-page handwritten document that was found on Luigi Mangione's person. What was he writing about?
Well, he was railing against the healthcare industry, which of course fits into the scenario here. He talks about how these parasites had it coming. He starts off basically saying, I don't want to cause any trauma, but it had to be done. So a second page really kind of goes into problems with the health industry. He raises the question, why do we have the most expensive healthcare in the world, but we're 42, rated 42 in life expectancy around the world? I can't vet his facts or findings there, but it was talking about the healthcare industry and the need for violence. I mean, especially when you talk about, the opening, which is that it had to be done. These parasites, had it coming. That does kind of fit in what they're talking about. What do we know about this individual? Mr. Mangione is an engineer. He grew up in Towson, Maryland. He's 26 years old. He graduated UPenn in 2020 and then went on to a master's program where he got that master's degree in engineering. And he has addresses, as Shimon said, in Towson, where he grew up, in Philadelphia, where he went to school, in Honolulu, which we're still looking into. But he is strongly believed to be the suspect in this case.
It's incredibly interesting. And it also speaks to the fact that he just had, Josh Campbell, you're with us now, so much on his person, according to police, from a suppressor to, they're saying it's the fake ID they believe that he used at the hostel, the New Jersey fake ID, when he was in New York, and then this manifesto talking about why he did this. That tells you a lot about his maybe expectation that ultimately this was all going to catch up with him, even as he tried to get away.
Yeah, you're spot on. And, sometimes these major incidents that start with a bang end with a whimper. We didn't see a dramatic, police takedown. What we saw is someone eating at a McDonald's who then had the police called on him and apparently taken into custody without incident. And, it's so interesting. John and I have been covering this. There was this consensus in looking at that initial surveillance video from outside that hotel that police weren't dealing with Carlos the Jackal here. I mean, you look at everything from his stance in holding that gun to the type of gun itself, to the mistakes that he had made, apparently leaving behind a water bottle and a burner phone. And so this was a sophisticated job in the sense that it appeared to be planned and then executed. And then he was able to successfully flee and, escape arrest for several days. But when you look at all of that material with him on his person, whenever he is actually taken into custody, someone who had the wherewithal to plan all of this and then to escape several law enforcement agencies would have had to have known that having all of that on his person would implicate him in this crime. As you mentioned, you have the fake ID, an ID that was matching the fake ID he used to check into that hostel. You have the mask that he had that was on these images that have been seen now around the world, and specifically the firearm itself. All of those items could have been ditched along the way as he was trying to escape, but he had them on his person. Of course, we can get into the firearms forensics if you'd like to see how that would actually play a key role here. But when you look finally at the manifesto, that you have to raise the question: is this someone who expected to be caught and didn't mind being caught eventually? Particularly if he is someone who was railing against the industry in which this murder victim had worked, to have all that material on you and then to have essentially the motive, laying out the motive in these documents for police to find. Everyone, any good attorney will tell you that the best way to escape any type of serious charge such as murder is to create reasonable doubt, to have no evidence on your person, to try to fight every accusation that comes your way. That much harder when you have all of that with you as you're taken into custody.
Yeah, certainly an intriguing point why he would have that kind of note on him. It speaks to some form of premeditation, at least. Josh Campbell, thank you for that. We also have with us Michael Alcazar, a retired NYPD detective. And on Friday, you talked about how critical DNA evidence would be not necessarily in identifying a suspect, but tying them to the crime. And in hearing about some of these details, specifically about the water bottle that was left behind and a partial fingerprint that was on that water bottle, I'm curious how significant a piece of evidence would that be in a future prosecution?
Yeah, this is absolutely huge that we have this suspect and then we process the crime scene, as best to the ability of the NYPD. We got DNA, we got fingerprints, we have the ammunition. So now hopefully we can link all that to this suspect. We are going to get DNA from him, get fingerprints off of him. The weapon, like the other person mentioned before, we can link it to the bullets because usually the barrel will have rifling. I know this is a ghost gun. Hopefully it still produces the same marks on the ammunition. So crime scene processing, the images that we put out, the Crime Stoppers tips, that's what helped solve this crime and make this arrest.
And John Miller, back to you. We're talking about why does he have all of this potential evidence on him, so much of it, but I guess there's also a question of what was the intent of the letter. In some crimes, you have people who send in their manifesto with the expectation they may or may not get caught. Do you have an idea, perhaps, what the intent could be, looking at cases like that?
Brianna, that's a really important question, and here's why. When you look at the note, I do apologize for any strife or trauma, but it had to be done. These parasites had it coming. This is a single homicide we're looking at. Parasites is in the plural. And the note itself, where he says, I acted alone, I'm self-funded, it suggests two potential things here. Number one, he was expecting to be caught somehow, somewhere, and wanted the note to say, I acted alone, this was just me, and here's the why. Or the other, even darker possibility, which is he intended to keep striking and at some point was going to release this note after he killed executives from other healthcare companies or other major corporations. We've looked at some of his other writings going back to the past on his social media and things he's posted, and he does rail against corporate America, against profiteering, against taking advantage of the consumer, and he does talk about how protest is ineffective and that violence is the next step that has to be taken. So a lot to kind of chew on there while they put together the charges, as Shimon said, and others get together the physical and forensic evidence that may tie him to this New York murder.
Josh Campbell, back to you, because Michael brought up something I found interesting. Obviously, in a lot of cases, forensic experts will look at a firearm and doing an analysis of the sort of grooves that are on the bullet, the impression that is left on a bullet, and it helps to tie, obviously, guns to certain incidents. I wonder how that might change, given that this is a ghost gun that officials believe was potentially printed by a 3D printer.
Well, so the ghost gun aspect would make it more difficult to try to tie it to past crimes. And we know that the bullet shell casings obviously recovered from the scene of the crime. That could be tested. The fact that we didn't hear of any matches to past crimes tells us that, this is something that he may have, procured maybe recently. Maybe he put it together himself, and maybe he's never used it before in the commission of a crime that was known to law enforcement. But it is still a critical piece of evidence because, as you mentioned, when you look at firearm testing, it's very much like a fingerprint. Whenever a projectile leaves the end of that gun, there are unique markings. You can see here, these are images of when I went inside the ATF lab to show this kind of testing. So they would take this gun into one of these facilities. They actually do a test to capture the bullet that is fired, but also the shell casing that gets ejected. And then they essentially take it under a microscope and actually look for those unique patterns. Whenever the shell casing makes contact with that gun, there are unique markings that law enforcement can look at. And what they're trying to do is see, is there a match? When you look at the shell casings found at the scene, you look at those bullets and you compare that with what was tested, all they're trying to do here is to match, was the gun found on this individual actually similar in nature to the characteristics of the rounds of ammunition left behind at the scene? And because of the unique nature of that testing, as I mentioned, somewhat like a fingerprint, that could be very strong evidence.